On a warm September afternoon in 1994, 6-year-old Emma Rose Sullivan walked out of Lincoln Elementary School in Millbrook, Indiana. Her mother was 3 minutes late for pickup, just 3 minutes. When she arrived, Emma was gone. For 28 years, the question haunted a family, a town, and a detective who couldn't let go. What happened to Emma Rose Sullivan? And then, in 2022, a construction crew digging 3 miles from the school made a discovery that changed everything. Emma's case wasn't cold anymore.
September 23, 1994, Millbrook, Indiana. Population 3,200. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where children rode bikes until dark and doors were left unlocked. Emma Rose Sullivan was 6 years old, first grade at Lincoln Elementary. She loved horses, drawing, and telling elaborate stories about fairies living in her backyard garden. Her teacher, Mrs. Patricia Green, would later say Emma was the kind of child who made you believe in magic. But on that Friday afternoon, the magic disappeared. Emma's mother, Catherine Sullivan, was a single parent. She worked as a bank teller and relied on a precise schedule. School pickup was at 3:15 p.m. every day. She was never late. But that Friday, Catherine's car wouldn't start. By the time she got her neighbor to drive her to the school, it was 3:18 p.m. 3 minutes, that's all it took. When Catherine arrived, the school playground was empty. Teachers were still inside, cleaning up classrooms. Emma had been outside with 12 other children, waiting for their parents. Mrs. Green had told Emma to wait by the flagpole. She was such a good girl. She always listened. When the teacher looked out the window 5 minutes later to check on the remaining children, Emma was gone. At first, no one was alarmed. Perhaps Catherine had arrived early. Perhaps Emma had gone to the bathroom. Perhaps she was hiding, playing a game. But Catherine hadn't arrived yet. Emma wasn't in the bathroom, and Emma Rose Sullivan was never seen again. By 4 p.m., Millbrook police were called. By 4:30 p.m., every teacher, parent, and child at the school was being questioned. By 5 p.m., search parties were forming. And by nightfall, a mother's worst nightmare had become reality. Emma Rose Sullivan had vanished from a school playground in broad daylight. No one saw her leave, no one heard her scream, no one saw a vehicle. It was as if the earth had simply swallowed her whole. But someone knew something. In a town of 3,200 people, someone always knows something. The question was, who? Detective Michael Hayes was 28 years old. This was his first missing child case. He made a promise that night, standing in the empty playground as searchlights swept the darkness. He told Catherine Sullivan he would bring her daughter home. He didn't know it would take 28 years to keep that promise. But that promise came with a cost, because what Detective Hayes was about to uncover wasn't just about one missing girl. It was about a predator who'd been hiding in plain sight for years, and Emma Rose Sullivan wasn't his first victim.
Within 48 hours, Emma's disappearance had become a federal case. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team arrived in Millbrook on Sunday morning, because Detective Hayes had discovered something that changed everything. Emma wasn't the first. In the past 6 years, 3 other girls had vanished from small Indiana towns within a 50-mile radius, all between ages 5 and 7, all taken from public places during after-school hours, all seemingly without a trace. 1988, Melissa Porter, age 7, disappeared from a library in Greenfield, never found. 1991, Sarah Chen, age 6, vanished from a grocery store parking lot in Oakdale, never found. 1993, Amanda Mitchell, age 5, taken from a community pool in Riverside, never found. And now, Emma. The FBI suspected a serial abductor. But serial abductors leave patterns, evidence, witnesses. This person left nothing. The FBI brought in cadaver dogs. They searched abandoned buildings, forests, wells, rivers. They interviewed every sex offender within 100 miles. They analyzed tire tracks, fingerprints, and hundreds of hours of witness statements. And they found nothing. Catherine Sullivan appeared on national news. America's Most Wanted featured Emma's case. The reward fund grew to $50,000. Catherine pleaded on television. Emma loves her stuffed rabbit. She calls him Mr. Hoppers. She can't sleep without him. Please, if you have my daughter, just please bring her home. She's just a baby. But weeks turned to months. Leads dried up. The FBI scaled back their presence, and slowly, painfully, Millbrook began to move on. Everyone except Catherine Sullivan and Detective Michael Hayes. Hayes refused to let the case go cold. Even as his superiors pushed him toward other investigations, he worked Emma's case in his spare time, on weekends, late at night, during his lunch breaks. He re-interviewed witnesses. He followed up on tips that other investigators had dismissed. He drove the route between all 4 abduction sites over and over, looking for connections. And then, 3 years after Emma disappeared, Hayes found something that had been overlooked, a detail so small, so seemingly insignificant that every other investigator had missed it. All 4 girls had visited the same place in the week before they disappeared, Millbrook Regional Library. It wasn't unusual. Millbrook Library served 4 counties. Thousands of children visited every month. But Hayes noticed something else. All 4 girls had checked out books on the same day of the week, Tuesday, all during the after-school program. And all 4 girls had been helped by the same library volunteer. His name was Robert Brennan, age 47, retired postal worker, widower, no children of his own. Volunteered at the library for 6 years, helping with children's reading programs. Everyone in Millbrook loved Mr. Brennan. He was kind, patient, gentle with children. He'd been cleared in the initial investigation because he had alibis. But Detective Hayes wanted to talk to him again. On November 3, 1997, Detective Hayes knocked on Robert Brennan's door. No one answered. Neighbors said they hadn't seen Brennan in over a week. Hayes obtained a warrant. When he entered the house, he found a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The basement had been converted into what the FBI would later call a collection room. Photos of hundreds of children, newspaper clippings about the 4 missing girls, and items, personal items that could only have come from the victims. Melissa's library card, Sarah's hair ribbon, Amanda's bracelet, and Emma's backpack, the one she'd been carrying the day she disappeared. But Robert Brennan was gone. His car was in the garage. His wallet was on the kitchen counter. His clothes were in the closet. But Robert Brennan had vanished as completely as the girls he'd taken. A nationwide manhunt was launched. His photo was everywhere. America's Most Wanted featured him as their top priority. The FBI believed he was alive, hiding, watching the news coverage. But weeks turned to months, and months turned to years. Robert Brennan was never found, and without him, without a body, without a confession, the 4 girls remained missing, presumed dead, but never confirmed. Catherine Sullivan never stopped hoping. Every birthday she set a place for Emma at the table. Every Christmas she bought a gift. Every day she waited.
Detective Hayes never stopped searching, even as he was promoted, even as he married and had his own children, even as retirement approached. Emma's case file never left his desk. And then, 28 years after Emma disappeared, a construction crew broke ground on a new housing development 3 miles outside Millbrook, and they found something that would finally bring Emma Rose Sullivan home.
March 17, 2022, a Thursday morning. The construction crew had been working on a new subdivision development called Meadowbrook Estates. The land had been farmland for decades, recently sold for development. At 9:47 a.m., an excavator operator named James Chen struck something unusual. At first, he thought it was a large rock, but when the crew investigated, they found a concrete structure, hidden 3 feet below the surface, deliberately buried. The crew stopped immediately. The site supervisor called the police, and at 10:15 a.m., Detective Michael Hayes, now 65 years old, weeks away from retirement, received a call that would change his life. The dispatcher said, "Detective Hayes, we have a situation at the Meadowbrook construction site. They've found what appears to be a buried concrete bunker. We need you here." Hayes had investigated hundreds of cases in his career, but he knew. Somehow he knew. This was about Emma. The concrete structure was a homemade bunker, 8 feet by 10 feet, reinforced walls, a heavy lid sealed from above. It had been there for decades, and it was located on what used to be Robert Brennan's family property. The farmland had belonged to Brennan's parents. They died in the 1980s, leaving the property to Robert. He'd sold it in 1998, a year after he disappeared. The sale had gone through a lawyer. Brennan was never seen. For 24 years, the land had sat unused, until now. At 2:30 p.m., with Detective Hayes, the FBI, and a forensic team present, they lifted the concrete lid. What they found inside confirmed every investigator's worst fears. It was a tomb, and inside were the remains of 4 children: Emma Rose Sullivan, Melissa Porter, Sarah Chen, Amanda Mitchell, all 4 girls who'd vanished between 1988 and 1994. They had been there all along, 3 miles from where Emma disappeared, hidden beneath the earth in Robert Brennan's family property. Forensic analysis would take weeks, but preliminary examination revealed what investigators suspected. The girls had been kept alive for days, possibly weeks. The bunker had been equipped with a ventilation system, rudimentary bedding and supplies. But eventually, Robert Brennan had sealed the bunker, and the girls never had a chance. Catherine Sullivan was 54 years old when Detective Hayes knocked on her door. She'd been waiting 28 years for this moment, and when he told her, she asked, "Is she coming home?" And Michael, Detective Hayes, he said yes. After 28 years, my baby was coming home. But the discovery of the girls raised more questions than it answered, because DNA analysis of the crime scene revealed something unexpected, something that meant this case wasn't closed. Not yet. The DNA found in the bunker didn't match just Robert Brennan. There was a second person, someone who'd helped him, which meant Robert Brennan hadn't acted alone. For 28 years, investigators had been looking for one man, but now they realized the truth. There had always been 2 predators, and one of them might still be alive. The second DNA profile didn't match anyone in the criminal database, which meant this person had never been arrested, never been suspected. They'd been hiding in plain sight for nearly 3 decades, and they might still be in Millbrook. The discovery of the second DNA profile turned Emma's case from a cold case resolution into an active manhunt, because somewhere, someone who'd helped Robert Brennan was still free. The FBI returned to Millbrook. Every piece of evidence from 1994 was re-examined, every witness was re-interviewed, and the town that had finally begun to heal was torn open again. Detective Hayes, who'd planned to retire in peace, instead found himself leading the largest investigation of his career. Because this time they had something they didn't have in 1994. Modern technology, genetic genealogy, the same technique that caught the Golden State Killer. The second DNA sample was submitted to genetic genealogy databases, and within weeks, the FBI had identified a family tree. The suspect was related to a family in Millbrook, the Hendersons, a well-known, respected family who'd lived there for generations. But which Henderson? And were they still alive? The FBI narrowed the DNA match to 3 possible individuals. All had lived in Millbrook in 1994. Thomas Henderson, age 72 in 2022, retired high school principal, widower, still living in Millbrook. David Henderson, age 68 in 2022, Thomas's younger brother, worked as a mechanic, died in 2019. Christine Henderson Marsh, age 65 in 2022, Thomas's sister, lived in Millbrook until 2001, then moved to Florida. The FBI needed more specific DNA samples to confirm which Henderson had been in the bunker, but requesting DNA samples would alert the suspect. They decided to collect samples covertly. Thomas Henderson's coffee cup from a local diner, David Henderson's DNA from his stored possessions, Christine Henderson Marsh's drinking glass from a restaurant in Tampa. The samples were rushed to the FBI lab, compared against trace DNA found in Brennan's storage unit. And 3 days later, the results came back. The DNA matched Thomas Henderson, the beloved former principal of Millbrook High School, a man who'd taught 3 generations of children, who'd received the town's Citizen of the Year award in 2015, who volunteered at the same library where Robert Brennan had found his victims. Thomas Henderson had helped Robert Brennan kidnap and imprison 4 little girls. But there was a problem. DNA placed him at the crime scene decades ago, but it didn't prove he'd known what Brennan was doing. A defense attorney could argue he'd simply visited the property innocently. To arrest Henderson, the FBI needed more. They needed proof of knowledge, conspiracy, intent. They needed him to confess. Detective Michael Hayes volunteered to conduct the interview. He'd waited 28 years. He deserved to be the one who brought Emma's last perpetrator to justice. On April 15, 2022, Detective Hayes and 2 FBI agents knocked on Thomas Henderson's door. Henderson answered immediately, smiled warmly, invited them in for coffee. And for the next 6 hours, Detective Hayes conducted the most important interview of his life. Hayes started gently. Background questions, Henderson's history with Brennan, how they'd met. Henderson answered calmly. "Oh, Robert and I were friends. We volunteered together at the library. Such a tragedy what happened. I had no idea he was capable of such evil." But Hayes had been a detective for 37 years. He could tell when someone was lying. And then Hayes showed Henderson the DNA evidence. Henderson's story changed. He admitted he'd been to the property, but insisted it was before the bunker existed, that he'd helped Robert's elderly father with farm work in the 1980s. Hayes didn't believe him, and he told him why. The DNA wasn't just on the bunker's exterior, it was inside, on the walls, on the ventilation system, in places only someone who'd been underground with the girls could have left it. Henderson fell silent. And then, after 20 minutes of silence, he looked up at Detective Hayes and he asked a question that changed everything. "If I tell you what really happened, will you tell their mothers I'm sorry?" For 6 hours, Thomas Henderson detailed a nightmare that investigators had never imagined. He and Robert Brennan had met in 1985, not at the library, but at a support group. A support group Brennan had started, supposedly for men struggling with inappropriate thoughts about children, but it wasn't therapy, it was recruitment. Brennan had used the support group to find like-minded predators, men who wouldn't report him, men who would help him. Henderson confessed that he'd helped Brennan build the bunker in 1987. They'd told Brennan's elderly parents it was a storm shelter, but it was never meant for storms. Henderson admitted he'd been there the day Emma was taken. He'd waited in a van 2 blocks from the school while Brennan approached Emma. Emma had trusted Brennan. She'd seen him at the library every week. When he told her there was an emergency with her mother, that he'd been sent to pick her up, she got in the van. Henderson drove while Brennan kept Emma calm with stories and promises. They took her to the bunker, and they kept her there for 9 days. Henderson claimed they'd planned to release her, that Brennan had promised they would just scare her, then let her go where she'd be found safely. Detective Hayes didn't believe him. Hayes confronted him. "You kept her in a hole in the ground for 9 days, a 6-year-old child, in the dark, terrified, crying for her mother, and you're telling me you planned to let her go?" Henderson broke down, and finally he told the truth. They never planned to release any of the girls. The bunker was designed to hold them until they were no longer useful to Brennan and Henderson's purposes. And then Brennan would seal the bunker, making it appear the girls had simply vanished. But what Henderson said next stunned everyone in the room. Henderson said, but Emma was different. According to Henderson, Emma had fought back. Despite being 6 years old, despite being terrified, despite being underground in the dark, Emma Rose Sullivan had tried to escape. On day 7, while Henderson was above ground and Brennan was distracted, Emma had managed to unscrew the ventilation grate with a bobby pin from her air. The shaft was too small for her to crawl through, but she'd pushed Mr. Hoppers, her stuffed rabbit, up through the opening, hoping someone would find him, hoping someone would know she was down there. But no one did. When Brennan discovered what Emma had done, he panicked. He told Henderson they needed to finish it immediately, that Emma was too smart, too brave, too dangerous to keep. That night, September 30th, 1994, Robert Brennan sealed the bunker, with all 4 girls inside. Emma had been there just 7 days, the others even longer. Henderson claimed he'd tried to stop Brennan, that he'd argued, that he'd felt guilty, but he'd done nothing to save them. And then Henderson revealed why Brennan had disappeared in 1997. Brennan hadn't run from the police, he was already dead. When Robert saw the police closing in, when he knew they'd found his house, he drove out to the property. Henderson thought he was going to move the girls, to hide them better, but Brennan shot himself out in the woods on the property. Henderson found him 3 days later. He buried him out there. Brennan had been dead for 25 years, buried on the same property as his victims. Within hours, search teams found his remains, a skeleton with a bullet hole in the skull, a rusted pistol nearby, exactly where Henderson said he'd be. But Henderson had one more revelation, one that sent ice through every investigator's veins. There were others. Before Melissa, before the bunker, Robert had been taking girls since 1982. The 4 girls they'd found weren't Brennan's first victims, they were just the ones he'd kept. The others, Henderson said, Brennan had killed immediately and buried in different locations.
Henderson provided approximate locations. Over the next 3 months, FBI teams would find 6 more victims, girls who'd been missing since the early 1980s, cases that had been cold for 40 years. 10 victims total, 10 families who would finally have answers. But there was one final question Detective Hayes needed answered. Hayes asked, did she suffer at the end? Henderson was silent for a long moment, and then he said, no. She was brave until the very end. She was singing, some song about rainbows. She was singing to comfort the other girls. Emma Rose Sullivan wasn't just a victim, she was a hero. On April 16, 2022, Thomas Henderson was arrested and charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. He pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. He will die in prison, like Robert Brennan should have. But for Catherine Sullivan and the other 9 mothers, the question remained, now what?
Between May and June of 2022, 10 funerals were held across Indiana. 10 little girls, missing for decades, were finally laid to rest. Melissa Porter, who would have been 41, Sarah Chen, who would have been 38, Amanda Mitchell, who would have been 34, Emma Rose Sullivan, who would have been 34, and 6 others whose names had been forgotten by everyone except their families. Emma's funeral was held on May 21, 2022, at Millbrook Community Church, the same church where Catherine had prayed every Sunday for 28 years, asking God to bring her daughter home. Over 800 people attended. The town that had searched for Emma in 1994 came to say goodbye in 2022. But Catherine Sullivan didn't cry at her daughter's funeral. Instead, she stood at the pulpit and told Emma's story, not as a victim, but as a hero. Catherine spoke, "My daughter was 6 years old, and in the darkest moment imaginable, when most adults would have broken, Emma sang. She sang to comfort children even younger than herself. She tried to escape. She fought. She never stopped being brave." Emma Rose Sullivan lived for 6 years, 3 months, and 7 days, and in that time she showed more courage than most people show in a lifetime. I am heartbroken, but I am also so incredibly proud to have been her mother. After the service, Detective Michael Hayes approached Catherine. In his hands was an evidence bag. Inside was Mr. Hopper's, Emma's stuffed rabbit, the one she'd pushed through the ventilation shaft, the one that had been recovered from the property, preserved as evidence. Hayes said, "The FBI released him. He belongs with Emma now." Catherine placed Mr. Hopper's in Emma's casket, and for the first time in 28 years, she let herself say goodbye. But Catherine's work wasn't finished, because there was one thing Emma's case had revealed that couldn't be ignored. The system had failed. Not just Emma, but 10 girls, across multiple jurisdictions, for decades. If Detective Hayes hadn't been personally obsessed with Emma's case, if he hadn't worked it on his own time for nearly 3 decades, these girls might never have been found. That couldn't happen again. 3 months after Emma's funeral, Catherine Sullivan stood on the steps of the Indiana State Capitol. Beside her were the mothers of all 10 victims, united, determined. They announced the formation of a new organization, Emma's Angels. Emma's Angels would be dedicated to finding missing children, funding cold case investigations, supporting families, and lobbying for changes in how missing children cases were handled. Within 6 months, Emma's Angels had helped solve 3 additional cold cases. Within a year, they'd lobbied successfully for new legislation requiring cross-jurisdiction cooperation in child abduction cases. Detective Michael Hayes, now fully retired, became the Foundation's chief investigator, pro bono.
Hayes said, "People ask me if it was worth it. 30 years, thousands of hours. My marriage almost didn't survive it. My kids grew up with a dad who was always working Emma's case. And I tell them, yes, because Emma deserved someone who wouldn't give up. Every missing child deserves that. And if my obsession brought her home, brought justice, and saved other children, then it was worth every minute." But there was one mother who struggled with closure more than the others. Linda Chen, mother of 6-year-old Sarah, refused to bury her daughter. Linda said, "I need to know. Did she suffer? Was she scared? Did she cry for me? I can't let her go until I know." The medical examiner had provided general information, but Linda needed more. She needed to know her daughter's final moments. And there was only one person who could tell her: Thomas Henderson. Linda Chen did something that shocked everyone. She requested a meeting with the man who'd helped kill her daughter. Catherine Sullivan begged her not to go. The other mothers warned her it would only bring more pain, but Linda needed answers more than she needed peace.
On August 3, 2022, Linda Chen sat across from Thomas Henderson in a prison visitation room, and she asked him one question. Did my Sarah, did she know I was looking for her? Did she think I'd abandoned her? Henderson cried, and then he told Linda something the FBI had kept from the mothers. Something found in the bunker that investigators had deemed too painful to share. But Linda deserved to know. The girls had written messages on the walls of the bunker, in the dark, with their fingernails scratching concrete. Sarah Chen had written 3 words over and over. "Mommy loves me. Mommy loves me. Mommy loves me." Sarah never doubted her mother's love, even in the darkness, even at the end. 3 days later, Sarah Chen was buried beside her grandmother, with her mother finally at peace. All 10 girls were home. All 10 families could begin to heal. But there was still one unanswered question that haunted Detective Hayes. The support group, the 12 men Brennan had recruited. Henderson and Brennan were accounted for. 3 others had been questioned and cleared. 2 were deceased. But 7 were still missing. 7 men who'd been part of Brennan's predator network. Were they still out there? Still dangerous? Or had Emma's case stopped them before they could become monsters?
By 2023, Emma's Angels had grown from a mother's support group into a national organization. 15 full-time employees, hundreds of volunteers, and a success rate that was changing the landscape of cold case investigations. They'd helped solve 18 cold cases in their first year, brought 12 missing children home, and provided support to over 300 families. But the 10 mothers who'd founded the organization carried a burden that newcomers couldn't understand. They knew what it was like to wait decades, to live with not knowing, to have hope die a little more each year. And they knew what it was like to finally get answers they'd prayed for and dreaded in equal measure. Catherine Sullivan had become the public face of Emma's Angels. She traveled the country, speaking at conferences, training law enforcement, advocating for families. But in private, she struggled. Emma's room remained exactly as it was in 1994. Catherine couldn't bring herself to change it. Every night, she'd sit in Emma's room and read from the diary she'd kept for 28 years, a letter to Emma every single day. Catherine's diary entry from May 21, 2022 read, "Dear Emma, today we said goodbye. I placed Mr. Hoppers with you. I told everyone how brave you were, how proud I am, but I didn't tell them that I still set the table for you every morning, that I still say goodnight to your empty room, that I still reach for the phone to call you before I remember you're gone." But Catherine wasn't the only mother struggling to move forward. Diane Porter, mother of Melissa, had battled alcoholism since 1988. She'd been sober for 3 years when Melissa's remains were found, but the confirmation of her daughter's death sent her spiraling again. Amanda's parents had divorced in 1995. Both had remarried, both had new children, and both felt crushing guilt. Amanda's father said, "How do you move on? How do you have another child when your first child is missing?" But you do, because life doesn't stop. And then they find her body, and your new children see you grieve, and they know they could never replace her, that they were always second. The mothers supported each other through therapy, through holidays, through the media attention that never quite faded. They celebrated small victories together, a new lead, a case solved, a family reunited. And they grieved together when cases ended badly, when remains were found instead of living children, when families had to accept the worst. But there was a secret that Catherine had never shared, not with the other mothers, not with Detective Hayes, not with anyone. A secret about Robert Brennan.
In 1992, 2 years before Emma disappeared, Catherine had taken 6-year-old Emma to the Millbrook Library. Emma had wandered off to look at picture books. Catherine was distracted, filling out a job application at the reference desk, and a kind man had helped Emma find a book about horses, Emma's favorite. Catherine had thanked him, thought nothing of it. He was a library volunteer, grandfatherly, safe. But when police showed her Brennan's photo in 1997, 3 years after Emma vanished, she'd recognized him immediately. She'd told the police, of course. It was important information, but she'd never told anyone the rest. The day Emma disappeared, Emma had mentioned the library man that morning. Emma had said, "Mommy, the library man said he's reading a story about princesses at the school today. Can I stay and listen?" Catherine, distracted by work stress, had said, "Not today, sweetie. Mommy will pick you up right at 3:15. For 28 years, Catherine had carried the weight of that moment. If she'd listened, if she'd asked more questions, if she'd called the school to verify, could she have prevented it? On the 1-year anniversary of Emma's burial, Catherine finally told Detective Hayes the truth. She expected judgment, blame, confirmation of her worst fears. Instead, Hayes reached across the table and took her hand. Hayes said, "Catherine, you were a single mother working 2 jobs. You were 3 minutes late to pick up because your car broke down, and you trusted a volunteer at a public library. None of that is your fault. Brennan was a predator. He would have found a way. It's what predators do. They wait, they watch, they manipulate. This was never your fault." But Hayes had a secret of his own. On September 23, 1994, Hayes had been called to the school at 4 p.m. By that time, Emma had been missing for 45 minutes, but Hayes had been off duty at a bar, having beers with friends. It took him 20 minutes to get to the school, 20 minutes where he could have been searching. For 28 years, Hayes had wondered if he'd been sober, if he'd arrived sooner, if he'd started the search 20 minutes earlier, would Emma still be alive? Catherine and Hayes sat in that coffee shop for 3 hours. 2 people who'd loved Emma, 2 people who'd carried impossible guilt, 2 people who dedicated their lives to making sure no other child was lost the way Emma was. And finally, they forgave themselves. But their peace was about to be shattered, because the FBI had just found something in Robert Brennan's recovered remains, something that meant the case wasn't over. Brennan had been buried with a key around his neck, a storage unit key, Unit 247, at a facility in Indianapolis. And inside that unit, investigators would find proof that Emma's angels had been right to keep searching, because Brennan and Henderson hadn't been the only predators in Millbrook.
The storage unit Robert Brennan had rented in 1983, 40 years earlier, had been paid for through an automatic bank account that had never been discovered or frozen. For 4 decades, it had sat locked, untouched, forgotten. Until now. What they found inside rewrote everything investigators thought they knew about Robert Brennan. The unit was filled with meticulous records, journals, photos, and videotapes. Robert Brennan had documented everything. The journals dated back to 1982. They detailed Brennan's crimes in disturbing precision, locations, victims, methods. But they also detailed something else. The support group, all 12 members, full names, addresses, what Brennan called their interest levels. Thomas Henderson had told the truth. Brennan had recruited men from the support group, but Henderson had lied about one thing. There weren't 12 members. There were 17. 5 additional predators. 5 men who'd helped Brennan in various ways: transportation, surveillance, covering alibis. Men who'd been hiding in plain sight for 40 years. Within 72 hours, the FBI had located 15 of the 17 names. 8 were deceased, natural causes, age, disease, accidents. 4 were in nursing homes, suffering from dementia, incapable of standing trial. 3 were arrested, 2 in Arizona, 1 in Florida, all now in their 70s and 80s. They would be charged as accomplices, but Brennan's journals indicated they'd never directly harmed children. They'd been enablers, facilitators, still dangerous, still culpable, but not murderers. But 2 names on Brennan's list remained unaccounted for. David Walsh, age 67, last known address Indianapolis, no records after 2015, and John Mercer, age 58, last known address Millbrook, Indiana. David Walsh's trail went cold, bank accounts closed, driver's license expired, no forwarding address. The FBI suspected he'd fled the country or assumed a new identity, but John Mercer was still in Millbrook. According to Brennan's journals, Mercer had been the most dangerous member of the group, not because he'd harmed children himself, but because he worked with children every day, and no one suspected him. The FBI began a covert investigation. They couldn't arrest Mercer without proof he'd committed crimes. Brennan's journals documented conversations, but not actions. They needed current evidence, or they needed Mercer to incriminate himself.
But there was a problem. Brennan's journals from before 1995 only used first names and physical descriptions. John was common. The description, tall, thin, dark hair, works with youth, fit hundreds of men. It wasn't until a journal entry from 1996 that Brennan used a last name, Mercer. The FBI cross-referenced the name, John Mercer, born 1964, lived in Millbrook from 1985 to 2005. Then, nothing. No death certificate, no forwarding address, no employment records after 2005. He'd vanished, just like Brennan, just like Walsh. Unless Detective Hayes had a theory. What if John Mercer hadn't left Millbrook at all? What if he'd simply changed his name, started over, a fresh identity in the same town where he'd always lived? It sounded paranoid, but Hayes had learned over 3 decades that predators were patient, clever, willing to hide in plain sight for years. He started looking for men who'd arrived in Millbrook around 2005, men with no prior history in Indiana, men who worked with children. And he found 3 candidates. James Parker, youth basketball coach, arrived 2006, background check, clean, references solid. Michael Torres, music teacher, arrived 2005, background check, clean, references solid. And Daniel Matthews, youth pastor at Millbrook Community Church, arrived 2005, background check, clean, references solid. One of these men might be John Mercer, or all 3 might be innocent, or Hayes might be wrong entirely.
But there was one way to find out. Get their DNA, compare it to samples from Brennan's storage unit. It was risky. If Hayes was wrong, he'd be violating innocent men's privacy, potentially destroying reputations. But if he was right, he might stop another predator before anyone else was hurt. Over 2 weeks, Hayes and a trusted FBI agent collected DNA samples. A coffee cup from the basketball coach, a water bottle from the music teacher, a communion cup from the youth pastor. The samples were sent to the lab, compared against trace DNA found in Brennan's storage unit, and on November 3, 2023, the results came back. There was a match, but it wasn't the person anyone expected.
Daniel Matthews had been youth pastor at Millbrook Community Church for 18 years, beloved, trusted, a pillar of the community. He'd counseled hundreds of teenagers, organized mission trips, led Bible studies. Parents felt safe leaving their children with him. He'd even spoken at Emma Rose Sullivan's funeral. And all along, he'd been John Mercer. The DNA match was conclusive. Daniel Matthews and John Mercer were the same person. In 2005, shortly after Brennan's storage unit payments were set up, John Mercer had legally changed his name, not in Indiana, in Kentucky, where it wouldn't be flagged in local records. He'd obtained new credentials, created a false background, and applied for a position that would give him access to the most vulnerable children, the troubled ones seeking spiritual guidance. But here's what terrified investigators. Brennan's journals about Mercer ended in 1997. After that, no mention, which meant they had no idea what Mercer had done for the past 26 years. Had he stopped? Or had he simply become more careful? The FBI needed to know if Mercer had harmed anyone since arriving in Millbrook as Daniel Matthews. But they couldn't arrest him without evidence, and they couldn't alert him to the investigation. They needed him to make a mistake or confess. On November 10, 2023, Detective Michael Hayes, now 66 years old, did something unauthorized. He went to confront Daniel Matthews, alone, without backup, without FBI approval. Because Hayes was done playing it safe, done waiting, done letting predators hide. Matthews was in his office, preparing Sunday's sermon. When Hayes entered, Matthews smiled, warm, welcoming. Matthews said, "Detective Hayes, what a pleasant surprise. How can I help you?" Hayes didn't take the extended hand. He said, "Hello, John." Matthews's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Matthews said, "I'm sorry?" Hayes said, "John Mercer, born 1964, member of Robert Brennan's support group, changed your name in 2005, thought you could hide in a church." Matthews could have denied it, demanded a lawyer, maintained his innocence. Instead, he did something unexpected. He laughed. Matthews said, "Took you long enough. I've been waiting 18 years for someone to figure it out." For the next 2 hours, Daniel Matthews, John Mercer, talked, and Hayes recorded every word. Mercer admitted he'd been part of Brennan's group, admitted he'd helped with surveillance, with planning, but he claimed he'd never touched a child, never harmed anyone, that he'd only been there for the community, the understanding. Hayes asked, "Then why change your name? Why hide?" Mercer said, "Because I knew how it would look. I knew no one would understand. So I started over, became someone new, someone who could help children without those urges." Hayes didn't believe him, and he told him why. In Brennan's storage unit, investigators had found photos, not of victims, but of potential targets. Children Brennan had been watching, planning to take. 93 photos total. 17 of those photos were taken at Millbrook Community Church, and they were dated 2008 to 2012, years after Brennan was dead. Someone had continued Brennan's work. Someone had kept watching, photographing, stalking. That someone was John Mercer.
But here's what saved those 17 children. In 2013, Millbrook Community Church hired a new senior pastor, Patricia Morrison, a woman who implemented strict child protection policies. No adult alone with a child, ever. Video cameras in all rooms. Background checks rerun annually. The kind of policies that made it impossible for predators to operate. Mercer claimed that's when he stopped, that the new policies had saved him from himself. But investigators believed otherwise. They believed Mercer had simply been prevented from acting on his urges, not by his own willpower, but by barriers put in place by a woman who understood that predators hide in churches. Pastor Morrison said, "I'd worked in child protection for 20 years. I knew predators seek positions of trust, of authority, where children are taught to obey adults without question. That's why we implemented those policies, not because I suspected anyone, but because I knew how predators operate." Pastor Morrison's policies had unknowingly stopped a predator she'd worked alongside for a decade, and likely saved 17 children from becoming Brennan's final victims. On November 11, 2023, Daniel Matthews, John Mercer, was arrested and charged with conspiracy, child endangerment, and being an accomplice to Brennan's crimes. He pled guilty to all charges and was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. It wasn't enough, but it was something. But Mercer had one final revelation before being taken to prison. Something about Robert Brennan that would change Emma's story one last time. Mercer said Brennan recorded everything, every crime, every victim. He kept the tapes in the storage unit, but there was a master tape, the original recordings, all in one place. He buried it before he killed himself, said if he ever got caught, he wanted people to know the truth, the whole truth, about all of us, about what happened to the girls. Mercer gave Hayes coordinates, a location on Brennan's old property, near where his body had been found. And 3 days later, FBI teams excavated the site and found a waterproof container buried 2 feet deep. Inside were 17 VHS tapes, labeled with dates 1988 to 1994, and one tape labeled simply The Garden.
The tapes were horrifying, exactly as investigators expected, but they were also something else. They were evidence, proof, documentation of crimes that could solve cold cases across multiple states. Within weeks, 3 additional murders were solved, 2 more accomplices were identified and arrested, and families who'd waited decades for answers finally learned the truth about their missing children. But it was the tape labeled The Garden that broke Detective Hayes. This tape was different. It wasn't documentation of crimes. It was something Brennan had made for himself, a recording of the girls in the bunker during their final days. FBI psychologists recommended Hayes not watch it, that he'd carried Emma's case for nearly 30 years, that he didn't need this final burden. But Hayes had made a promise to bring Emma home, to know her truth, and he needed to know if she'd suffered. What Hayes saw on that tape, it wasn't what he expected. 2 hours later, Catherine Sullivan sat beside Detective Hayes, and together they watched the tape that Robert Brennan had never intended anyone to see. The tape showed 4 little girls in the darkness of the bunker, terrified, crying, begging to go home. But it also showed something else. It showed Emma Rose Sullivan doing exactly what Thomas Henderson had described. She was singing. Catherine whispered, "That's the song I used to sing to her every night before bed.
somewhere over the rainbow. Emma had been singing the song her mother sang to her. In the darkness, in the terror, she'd been holding on to her mother's love, and she'd been singing it to comfort the other girls, to give them hope, to help them feel less alone. On the tape, 6-year-old Emma could be heard speaking to the others. Emma's voice said, "Don't be scared. Mommy says when you're scared, you sing, and then you remember that someone loves you. So we're going to sing, okay? All of us, together." And then 4 small voices singing together in the darkness, singing about rainbows and hope and believing that somewhere, someday, they'd be found. The tape ended on day 7, the day before Brennan sealed the bunker. The last thing recorded was Emma's voice. Emma said, "Mommy will find us. I know she will. She always finds me when we play hide and seek. Always." And she did, baby. It took 28 years, but she did.
Catherine Sullivan requested a copy of that tape, against every recommendation, against all psychological advice, because she needed to hear her daughter's voice again. And she needed to know that Emma had held on to hope, had held on to love, had been brave until the very end. 3 months later, on March 17, 2024, the town of Millbrook held a dedication ceremony. The empty lot where Emma's Case Command Center had stood in 1994 was now a memorial garden. Emma's Garden, with 10 sections, each dedicated to one of Brennan's victims. At the center was a bronze sculpture, 4 little girls, holding hands, looking upward, and above them a rainbow arching across the garden. Catherine Sullivan spoke at the dedication in front of 800 people, the same 800 who'd attended Emma's funeral. Catherine said, "My daughter lived for 6 years, but her courage will live forever. Because of Emma, 4 other girls had comfort in their darkest hours. Because of Emma, Detective Hayes never gave up. Because of Emma, 10 families have answers. Because of Emma, laws have changed. Children are safer. Predators are caught." Emma Rose Sullivan was a hero at 6 years old, and I am so proud to have been her mother. Detective Michael Hayes, now retired, stood beside the memorial. He'd kept his promise. Emma was home. Hayes said, "People ask me if it was worth it. 30 years, thousands of hours. My marriage almost didn't survive it. My kids grew up with a dad who was always working Emma's case." And I tell them, yes, because Emma deserved someone who wouldn't give up. Every missing child deserves that. And if my obsession brought her home, brought justice, and saved other children, then it was worth every minute. Today, Emma's Angels Foundation operates in 40 states. They've helped solve over 200 cold cases. They've brought 73 missing children home. Catherine Sullivan is their CEO, working tirelessly to make sure no other parent waits 28 years for answers. And Detective Michael Hayes trains new investigators, teaching them what he learned from Emma's case. Never give up. Never assume it's hopeless. Never stop searching. As for John Mercer, he sits in federal prison, 15 years, eligible for parole in 2031. But Pastor Patricia Morrison has ensured that every church in America knows his story, knows how he hid, knows what policies stopped him. And because of her work, thousands of churches have implemented the same protection policies that unknowingly saved 17 children in Millbrook. David Walsh, the final missing accomplice, was found in 2024, living under an assumed name in Costa Rica. He was extradited, charged, convicted. Justice delayed but delivered. And somewhere over the rainbow, in Emma's Garden in Millbrook, Indiana, Children play. They run through the flowers. They laugh. They sing. And their parents watch, vigilant, protective, never taking safety for granted. Because Emma's story taught a community and a nation that evil hides in plain sight. But it also taught them something more important, that love is stronger than darkness, that courage can shine in the smallest voices, and that hope, even hope that takes 28 years to fulfill, is never wasted. Emma Rose Sullivan sang in the darkness, and the world heard her song. This is her legacy. This is her light. This is why we never stop searching. In memory of every missing child, and in honor of everyone who never stops looking. If you have information about a missing child, call the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-THE-LOST. Never give up, never stop searching, never stop singing in the dark.